thank you all for being here to discuss regulating social consumption. I'm going to let our panel do some introductions, and then we're just going to do kind of a round table discussion like some of the panels were yesterday. So I'm Molly Duplashane. I'm the Deputy Director of Policy for the Department of Excise and Licenses with the City of Denver, which includes the Office of Marijuana Policy.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Marley Bordowski. I'm the director of the prosecution section of the Denver City Attorney's Office. I don't know where that went. I've worked with Molly and Ashley Kilroy since 2014 in implementing the regulations that we have here in Denver and dealing with some of the issues that have arisen over the years. So we've been neck deep in it for the last 4 years.
Hey, I'm Brandon Goldner. I'm the program coordinator of the City of Portland's cannabis program. Been with that program since 2015 and been the supervisor for just over a year now.
Good morning, I'm Sarah Oates, and I am the State of Alaska's program coordinator for the Alcohol and Marijuana Control Office. Brandon did an introduction yesterday, so I'll do a little bit more of one today. I started with the agency 7.5 years ago, back when we just regulated alcohol. And then in 2014, our ballot measure passed to legalize marijuana. We did not have an existing medical marijuana scheme, so we were kind of frantic, like, oh my gosh, what do we do? We flew down to Denver and had a lot of help from Colorado and Washington, and Oregon was also here because they passed at the same time. And so our 10-member staff and director was responsible for drafting regulations because our ballot measure was only 6 pages. So most of our laws are in regulation. We started accepting applications in early 2016, and we currently have about 260 operating licenses. 70 or so of those are retail, and 160 are cultivation facilities. And we've got about 200 applications that are in various other statuses of the process.
Great. All right, so this really interesting topic of social consumption was one that from the very, very early stages, right after everything, all the sales and stuff started on January 1st, 2014, the question pretty quickly came up, okay, so now that it's legal to purchase it, where can people consume it? So something that's really interesting about all 3 of the states that are on the panel today, Colorado, Oregon, and Washington, is that none of those state initiatives or amendments included any framework for social or public consumption. In fact, some of them, well, most of them still expressly prohibit public consumption. So some of the newer states that are coming on now, like California and Massachusetts, now include a license type and the ability to issue licenses and regulate social consumption. But none of us are here had that kind of had that comfort, and in fact, we're between a rock and a hard place with having it be prohibited at the state level, but having to address it at the local level. So I'm going to jump in with that kind of framework and start with Marley. So knowing that there is no statewide framework for social consumption of marijuana, Denver did pass a citizen-initiated ordinance in 2016 that allowed for events and businesses to designate an area of their business for social consumption. Can you just walk us through some of what the conflicts are with state and federal law that make it difficult for Denver to address the issue prior to passage of that ordinance?
Sure. I can say that we've struggled with this in Denver since 2014. There are a lot of conflicts in our state law that prohibit the open and public consumption of marijuana, but we're starting with the fact at the federal level that marijuana is just illegal at all, and that the Cole memo back in the day called for strict rules and robust enforcement of marijuana laws to highlight the federal priorities of prohibit distribution to children, the out-of-state diversion of marijuana, those kinds of things. And so we were already dealing with, okay, how do we thread the needle at the federal level and also implement the will of our voters? I can say in 2012, the feds came in and shut down, I don't remember how many, but several medical marijuana dispensaries at that time that were too close to schools. So we knew that they took those priorities seriously. We needed to thread that needle. Then we had to look again at the state laws that were in conflict that could be a problem with this initiated ordinance. So we had the prohibitions for open and public consumption of marijuana. What does that mean? There really is no definition in state law of what open and what public means. There is a definition at the state level and at the local level of a public place, and so that's kind of where we started our analysis. Public place is defined at both levels as a place to which the public or a substantial number of the public has access, and then give some examples of what that includes. So we started there. What does the public or a substantial number of the public having access mean? If we put restrictions on that, does that reduce the substantial number significantly enough that it no longer is public? So we started with that kind of analysis. There were some restrictions in our licensing structure at the state level. Only marijuana stores, retail marijuana stores or medical marijuana centers can sell marijuana. So none of these clubs in this citizen-initiated ordinance would be able to sell anything. So the only business model they could create was a BYOC, right? Bring your own cannabis. There couldn't be any consumption on a licensed marijuana facility, either on a grow, a store. If you're a licensed marijuana facility, you could not consume. So there was another restriction. We have the Colorado Clean Indoor Air Act, which prohibits indoor smoking, which also includes indoor smoking of marijuana. So there was that layer of restrictions on there. It's lots of restrictions at the federal and state level here. And then we also had a recently passed, at that time, liquor rule by our Liquor Enforcement Division that liquor licensed facilities could not allow the consumption of marijuana. So all of the bars or restaurants that had liquor license were out. So that really narrowed the field of what kinds of businesses could apply for these permits under this citizen-initiated ordinance. Within the ordinance itself, then, it had more restrictions about distance from schools. It had to be a designated consumption area, had to be 1,000 feet from a school. And there were other not as prohibitive restrictions in there. They had to have community support, so either support or non-opposition from a registered neighborhood organization in our city. They had to have a community engagement plan, a health and sanitation plan, and a responsible operations plan, and only be open to 21 and over. So all of that is in the ordinance itself. Then the Department of Excise and Licenses, through a really robust process, I think we met for 4 months, an advisory group came up with some additional rules and regulations that went into effect that put in a couple additional proximity restrictions that are similar to the restrictions that we have in place for stores and centers, 1,000 feet from daycares, 1,000 feet from drug rehab centers, and those kinds of things. So there were a lot of challenges just on the state and federal level that we were trying to grapple with early on.
Great, thank you, Marley. So Brandon, kind of same question to you. Oregon also doesn't have a statewide framework for social consumption, so can you tell us what the current landscape is in Portland and Oregon for social consumption?
No. Of course, yeah. Oregon has many of the same restrictions on consuming cannabis as Colorado. You can't consume in a public place, which in Oregon is defined as a place to which the general public has access. And I'll talk more about that a little bit later. And Oregon's Indoor Clean Air Act includes both tobacco and cannabis, just like Colorado. But unlike Colorado, Oregon also includes vaporization. So you're not allowed to vaporize indoors, either cannabis or tobacco. So that's an additional restriction. And then also, like Colorado, you can't mix alcohol and cannabis. And by that, I mean if you have an OLCC liquor alcohol permit, you can't have cannabis there. So that's also similar. Right now in Oregon, there is no framework for social consumption, or in Portland. In 2017, there was a bill that did have the support of the city of Portland in our program to create a framework for social consumption. That bill did not pass, but there are some concepts floating around for this upcoming legislative session that we are hopeful will get some more traction. There have been more conversations with legislators. I think the conversation about the social consumption of cannabis has been moving a little bit. And so in the meantime, what Portland has done, we released a guide for if people do want to have an event with cannabis, how they can do it while navigating this regulatory gray area. So, and it was pretty funny. We released it on 4/20, of course. And when I floated it by the city attorney, because it had guidelines, state law, state rule, city code, at first they said, well, are you sure you want to be giving legal advice to people? I don't know about that. And I said, well, what if I just put a disclaimer on it that says this is not legal advice, this is for guidance? And he said, well, that's okay. And essentially what you have left is if you have an event, if it's not open to the public, if it's outdoors, if it's 21 or over, if you're bringing your own cannabis, then you kind of fall into this regulatory gray area. And the problem that's caused in Portland and Oregon is that it kind of goes back to that what is or is not a public place. So in order to have an event like this and kind of navigate all of those hurdles, it basically has to be an event that is ticketed in some way, so someone can't just walk into the event and begin consuming cannabis. So that's the way people are right now navigating this. So there are a lot of reasons why we think it's important to have such a framework, and I don't know if that's going to come up in a different question or if that's...
No, you can go into that now.
Okay. Well, actually, let me step back. I'd like to, yeah.
Okay, let's ask the question to Sarah then. So same thing, Alaska again has no statewide framework, but you guys have contemplated this over the years, and so can you tell us kind of how it's evolved in Alaska?
Sure. So like most of the other states, in the statute are the specific license types that are allowed in our state, and none of those license types specify social consumption. However, the drafters of our ballot measure argued that a section of the statute was ambiguous enough to allow for a type of permit or endorsement for social consumption at a licensed premises of a retail store. So over the last couple of years, we've worked on numerous drafts, at least a half dozen drafts, to create an on-site consumption endorsement for licensed retail marijuana stores. And in Alaska, our ballot measure only passed by 52%. So we still have a very significant amount of the population that is anti-marijuana, very anti-marijuana. So the public comments that we got when we put the various drafts out were very polarized. We had lots of people who were pro-industry and wanted to have a place to allow for social consumption, and then we had people who just outright didn't want marijuana in our state at all, and we were ruining people's lives. And but then we also got a number of good comments from members of the public health sector, from the American Cancer Society, from people who had concerns about smoking, and the bill over time. The regulation project over time stalled out. The last draft, not including our current draft, stalled out almost a year ago because our regulators had heard that Massachusetts was working on an on-site consumption bill or regulation, and Alaska didn't really want to be the first. Our regulatory framework is interesting in that I work for the staff, so I work directly for the director, and we report to two different boards. We report to the Alcoholic Beverage Control Board and the Marijuana Control Board, and we are housed for administrative purposes under the Department of Commerce. So they control our budget, they control our HR, and so it's a very odd situation. So our Marijuana Control Board is made up of two industry members, a public health seat, a public safety seat, and then a rural member. And our rural member tends to be our swing vote. So depending on the particular topic, it could go industry or it could go public health and safety and go no. So our swing vote for that last draft a year ago was like, no, let's wait for Massachusetts. Well, with the Cole memo being destroyed, our public safety member, who was a chief of police, decided to step down from the board. He didn't feel comfortable anymore being a board member, so we had a hard time filling that public safety seat, or the governor had a hard time filling that public safety seat, and the rest of the board wanted to wait to continue working on this on-site consumption endorsement until we had a full board. So now that we have a full board, the board decided to put out, or to create a subcommittee to work on this on-site consumption draft, because the industry had issues with it, public health had issues with it. So our subcommittee was composed of the director and our public health member and one of our industry members. And so they put together a 15-page draft that our board decided to put out for public comment, and the written public comment period closed yesterday. So last night, I had one of my staff send me all of the public comments that we received, and so I was reading until midnight about 200 pages of public comments on this project, and about 2/3 of them were in support of an on-site consumption endorsement, and about 1/3 of them were in opposition. And so the people who were supportive of it were supportive for reasons like, we need a place for parents to consume outside the home. We want a place for people who use it for medical purposes to consume outside the home. And most importantly, we have a huge tourism economy. And we get tons of cruise ship passengers who flood our little teeny towns of 980 people that explode into, a 10,000 or 20,000 population town overnight. And these people want to consume marijuana and can't consume them on the cruise ships. And so they're just having to find places in public areas to illegally consume. And we'll get to the enforcement piece later. But so it seems like there are some valid reasons for wanting this place. And then also, valid concerns from the public health sector about smoking. On October 1st of this year, our smoke-free workplace legislation became effective, but it does have an exception in there for a building that is freestanding, or a building that is attached to another business or building if it has a separate entrance and various other things. So the regulation project, I'll quickly go over, sorry I'm taking so much time, some information that's in the regulation project. So, first of all, on February 24th, 2015, when our ballot measure statutory language went into effect, the Alcoholic Beverage Control Board at the time was responsible for regulating marijuana because there wasn't a statute yet, there wasn't legislation yet that would create a separate board. So the ABC board adopted an emergency regulation on that date that defined the definition of in public, because the statute said you can't smoke in public. I'm not going to read that definition because it's very long, but it has since been revised to provide an exemption for retail stores that get this on-site consumption endorsement. And so the 15 pages of draft language include the ability for a local government to protest the endorsement. So local governments in Alaska have lots of control and power. They can protest the issuance of licenses, and they can also put restrictions on licenses. They can pass lots of local ordinances. They can completely opt out, either by ballot initiative or by a local ordinance. So the language allows for them to either protest the endorsement separately or to completely opt out of on-site consumption entirely. The language also sets a limit on the quantity of cannabis that can be sold for consumption on-site, and it restricts the cannabis that's consumed to that which is purchased on the premises. No concentrates can be consumed on site, and there has to be a separated area from the rest of the retail shop that is a smoke-free area, that has a smoke-free area for employees. It either has to have ventilation or be located outdoors, and of course conform to local laws. And it requires a pretty detailed security plan to be provided, and that the applicant contact any neighbors within, I believe it's a 200-foot area of the premises. So we have a public hearing on December 19th, during which the board will receive verbal public comment, and the board will decide whether or not to adopt the regulation project on December 20th or 21st during its meeting.
Okay, so I think we'll go back to Brandon for a second, and so I think you were going to start talking about why you think Portland feels that it is important to start regulating social consumption.
Yeah, and Sarah touched on some of those points, and just to repeat, the part about medical patients is extremely important. You have folks who have a prescribed medical cannabis card, and they may live in Section 8 housing. If it's found that they've been consuming cannabis in their home, they could get kicked out. And there are also folks who may be lower income renters. Again, they may not have a place to go and consume cannabis, where people who may be more fortunate to own their own home do have that option. And we also know just the inequitable enforcement of cannabis laws historically affecting communities of color disproportionately. And I think that we heard from some of our friends in Denver about how that enforcement is continuing to be disproportionately affecting certain populations. Sarah also mentioned tourism. It's a huge thing in Oregon too. I mean, Oregon has a very robust craft beer and wine industry. And Oregon also has a robust craft cannabis industry, and frankly has, preceding legalization of cannabis. And so it does seem odd that you could come to Oregon and you could purchase cannabis, but you may not have anywhere to consume it. So providing those options for consumers, we feel is important. Sarah also mentioned, you hit on a lot of my points. Parents, if you have kids at home, if you want to be responsible adults and go out, get a babysitter and consume cannabis somewhere other than your home, that seems to make a lot of sense. And then also, consumption is happening already. As I spoke about before, you have these events that are taking place. You have people who are smoking on the street. I mean, I've had meetings at City Hall in Portland. It looks out onto a Max station, and I've seen people consuming cannabis right there at the stop. We need to give those folks a place to go, at least give them an option, in my view. And also for regulators and for folks who may be a little bit cagey about the prospect of creating a framework for social consumption, one thing I like to hit on is having that regulatory certainty is really important for us as regulators to know what are the rules, be able to communicate those clearly and help people follow them. I mean, I spoke earlier about this guide that we created. It was cobbled together from state law and rule and local rule and had some recommendations in there. We'd prefer to not have to do that. We prefer to have a clear set of guidelines that we can provide for people that is, enshrined in law. Last, it's an economic development opportunity for the state, absolutely. In our view, there are a lot of rules why there ought to be some framework for social consumption. The last point on this is, again, for folks who may be a little less comfortable with these conversations, one thing to think about for states who have like a ballot initiative process where citizens can put something on the ballot, it might behoove you to be at the table at those conversations and get something to the legislature that has partners from public health, from youth prevention, and also from the cannabis industry, and to not wait for a ballot measure to come. I mean, I've heard some rumblings about a potential ballot measure in Oregon along with these potential legislative concepts. And so in my view, it's better to have everybody at the table working together, even if you don't agree on everything, so that your voice is represented. So for all those reasons, the City of Portland feels like it is very important.
So yeah, we talked a lot yesterday in one of the panels about having the industry and all the different stakeholders at the table. So Marley, can you maybe run through what the process in Denver looked like to build out the regulations that are currently on the books for Denver social consumption?
Sure. I'm just going to back up for a minute. Ours it's Amendment 64, and it's a constitutional amendment, as opposed to, it sounds like both of yours are statutory. So we have a lot less room to wiggle, if you will. So we're kind of bound by the terms of the constitutional amendment, and our constitutional amendment is it considered private personal use of marijuana, and there was no structure built at all in the Constitution for the concept of a social club, and Molly mentioned that a little bit ago. So that's an additional needle eye that we're trying to thread throughout all of this. This has been on the state legislative, I think, on the state legislative ballots and initiatives since 2014. every single year. One got through last year, but the governor ended up vetoing that one. And so this one got through in Denver in 2016. Ashley Kilroy, the marijuana policy director, and Molly, her deputy director, put together a advisory group. It consisted of industry, it consisted of health providers, Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, it consisted of community members, citizens, it consisted of business leaders in the city of Denver, those kinds of things. It consisted of some city agency members. Probably about 20 or so members on this advisory committee, and we met regularly for a period of 4 months, trying to develop some rules and regulations that made sense to stand this thing up and also thread the needle of state law. And so we worked through that for that 4 months. I think I touched on some of the rules that are in place right now. The big one that's in ordinance is that it has to be an existing business. So if you have a coffee shop, you can take your coffee shop and designate an area within your coffee shop as that's your designated consumption area or your DCA. If you just can't, open up your home and now your home is a DCA, although that's a little bit different of an example, but you have to have some underlying business, partly because that's what's in ordinance, but also there's no money-making model here. It's a BYO, bring your own, and so you can't sell it. How are you going to make your money? You need some kind of underlying business. There also is a provision for events. So if you have an existing event, here we have something called, for example, just use this as an example, Taste of Colorado. You can have a designated consumption area at your event, and there are different rules that apply to that. I think I mentioned earlier the neighborhood support or community support. That was also critical part of our ordinance. I think that, so it can't be just your neighbor says it's fine, Joe can do it. It's that you have to have an organized community or group that gives that support or non-opposition. So a registered neighborhood organization or a business improvement district, something like that.
So Marley, can you tell us, so we're about 2 years now since that ballot initiative passed here in the city of Denver. Where are we at in reality? How's that playing out?
I know that we have one that's opened. It's a coffee shop, the Coffee Joint. I had to think of what the name of that was. It's been up and running for a while now, I think most of this year. We have one that's passed through the application process and is just going through inspections right now. So all businesses in Denver have to go through inspections from fire, zoning, public health, those kinds of things. So this one is well along in the process, and it's, I think, going to call itself Vape and Play. So the underlying business there is kind of an arcade, kind of, go and play video games and that kind of thing. So we've got one up and running and one getting close.
Yep. And I think, Marley, you really hit on it earlier, is just that, so it's 2 years in and we only have one business operating. And unfortunately, that's the rock and the hard place that we were put between with threading this needle. And there is no economic incentive, there is no viable business model here unless you have something like the coffee shop and or an arcade or some other type of business model for them to hang their hats on. Since they can't sell cannabis, they can't sell liquor, they have to have something to bring them people in and keep them in. So let's shift gears a little bit, and Brandon, can you tell us, so obviously, you've had legal cannabis sales for a while now, so people are obviously consuming it somewhere, they're not just buying it and putting it in their pocket. So where are you seeing people consuming it, and do you have enforcement issues with that?
Yeah, I mentioned earlier an anecdote of someone consuming at a bus stop, but there are also, as I mentioned earlier, events that do take place that try really, really hard to navigate the various state and local requirements. So one thing that we did do as a program is we requested, when folks are making street closure requests, through our Bureau of Transportation, there were some little boxes there about, are you going to have alcohol in the public right-of-way? And so we requested, if those come through, could you add a little tick box for cannabis? And that happened a couple years ago. And so we've seen requests for street closures come through and say, yes, we're going to have cannabis there. Now, you might be thinking, well, that's, didn't you say earlier you can't consume in public, and isn't the street a public place? And the answer is yes. So what we've seen in those instances are that they request a street closure for part of the event, and then they have the consumption taking place in a private business adjacent to that street. Our program has attended some of those events just to make sure that everything is on the up and up. And the ones that we have attended have all been following the rules as best they can. And so that's encouraging. And some of those event organizers are people that we've worked with and given guidance to in the past. So that's, we also have a couple of places in Portland where they had a lounge model where people were consuming indoors. That's where it gets very, very tricky. And even though our program doesn't enforce the Indoor Clean Air Act, we want to be a resource and be helpful for folks when they call and have questions. So a couple years ago, there actually was an indoor lounge that was trying to skirt the requirement that people can't consume in a public place or in an enclosed area if it's a public place by calling themselves a private club, that it's a dues-paying club. The Oregon Health Authority took a different interpretation in that particular case and actually sent some violations, and that one location shut down. But there are at least a couple of others in Portland that are, again, operating as an indoor private club. That is a little further toward the end of the spectrum of probably not legal currently. So those are the kinds of things that we have seen in Portland.
So just to clarify, at those events, then they go onto a private space and they can consume there as long as it's considered private.
Outdoors as well, I
Outdoors.
should clarify that. And the guidance that we've given for folks is it should be outdoors and also outside of the view of the public. So having like a fencing where people can't see in. There are concerns, particularly from youth prevention, public health, about people seeing people, or children seeing people consume cannabis. So the guidance that we give is just to keep it out of the view of the public. But yeah, that consumption has always taken place outdoors in those events.
Do you receive issues about orders or complaints like that from those events?
We haven't from those events. Usually they're in places that are a little further away from other folks. There's one in particular that happens every year called Summer Fair. It's in a kind of a quasi-industrial area where there's not a lot of other folks to bother. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Sarah, how about you? People are consuming cannabis in Alaska, I assume. So where are they doing it, and do you have enforcement issues?
Well, we actually have had case law since the 70s that has allowed for personal possession of marijuana. So it's been consumed for many years legally. But now with the addition of the regulated market, we have noticed a lot of increased consumption in public areas. Again, as I touched on earlier, we have lots of tourists who come in from cruise ships, and those passengers will consume in whatever public areas. A lot of our state is national park or U.S. Forest Service area, and so people are consuming in federal areas too, which is interesting. But we do see a lot of public consumption, and again, a number of local law enforcements are turning a blind eye when they see tourists consuming cannabis in their communities because they want tourists to continue to come back. And right now, the penalty for consuming in public is a $100 ticket. I know of very few of those that have actually been issued. And so another place that we've had consumption occurring in public is almost identical to what Brandon just talked about. We had a number of private clubs, social clubs that opened, and in 2015, maybe 2014, and in 2015, the former director and I sent a cease and desist letter to those businesses. And I talked about our interesting relationship with our board earlier today, and the board at the time essentially told us to stand down from those. As you heard, the board is relatively industry-heavy, friendly, and so I got the impression that the board wanted for there to be a place where people could consume outside of their home, and so they didn't want us to enforce at that time. For over the next year, we worked with the AG's office to get a legal opinion on the definition of a social club and whether that truly was a private club or not. They were charging a fee at the door, but it was BYOC, and essentially the only authority that we would have would be to send an investigator into there and write a $100 ticket to anybody who attended. And there wasn't a clear penalty in our statute or regulation for the actual business owner. So in 2016, we finally got an AG opinion that said that that type of club was illegal. At the same time, the owner of that club unfortunately passed away, and the other business owners decided to not continue with the club, so they closed it. And then we also have some events that take place similarly to what Brandon talked about. We have competitions and trade shows and whatnot that take place in our state, typically kind of in the middle of nowhere. And in the past, they've occurred in some of our municipal conference buildings. And the municipality of Anchorage no longer, at least to my knowledge, lets them hold those events in there if there's going to be consumption of cannabis, which there always is, at least not at this time. And so these events that are taking place out in the middle of nowhere, oftentimes the organizers will contact us and ask how they can do things legally. We've had a couple of organizers who insisted that our AG's opinion was wrong and that we were wrong, and they promoted public consumption at their events and argued that it wasn't public, but it was public. And so for those organizers who were promoting the consumption of marijuana at the events, they were brought before the Marijuana Control Board and had civil fines imposed on them. I can't really speak to those cases much because they are both in appeal right now, but we will see what happens with those. But we have had a couple of event organizers who made sure that they clearly followed the rules that we set forth. There was public consumption that occurred at the events, but they had signs posted saying no public consumption. They made sure that everybody who entered the event was 21, and they did their due diligence as we instructed them to not promote the consumption of cannabis at the event. So that's what we have.
So same question, I guess, for Denver Marley. I know we now have one, hopefully two, designated consumption areas operating. It's here pretty soon. Can you talk about what type of enforcement issues we see here in Denver?
I would just say ditto. I think we're all seeing the same things. We see a lot of public consumption in our public spaces, parks, our 16th Street Mall. We just see that. It's just the nature of the beast. We do have an annual 420 rally. It's called different things, different years, but it's a big event in our Central Park area, our Civic Center Park, that's in our Central Denver area. That attracts a lot of people. They do, as Sarah was saying, they also put up signs, no public consumption. The event organizer, at least this last year, was very cooperative with the city and worked with us to put signage up. We walked the park with him. He was very good about shutting illegal activity down and that kind of thing. So getting a great event organizer is really key to these kinds of things, but it didn't prevent the public consumption. The big puff of smoke at 420 happened anyway. We also have battled for years with the private club models that folks are trying to stand up. It's that threading. I read to you earlier what a public place is, and it's, again, them trying to thread that needle. What is open to a substantial number of the public? And it's a difficult needle to thread if all you're doing is charging a cover charge. That's still a public place. That's not going to get you to the private. So trying to figure out what's private, sufficiently private, so that you are, hitting that sweet spot, people have struggled with. And we have been, when I say we, the Denver Police Department in conjunction with the Denver City Attorney's Office have been pretty proactive in enforcing against the private clubs that really aren't. It's very time intensive, it's very resource consuming for very small tickets, to Sarah's point. We do cite the owners of these clubs. We cite them with violations of the Colorado Clean Indoor Air Act, public consumption, being complicit in public consumption that's going on in their businesses. And then we do have a couple of city ordinances that prohibit having a marijuana business other than the ones that are articulated in our licensing ordinances. So we have a couple of things that we can cite the owner with. Again, they're very low-level types of violations, but we have been proactive about doing that and enforcing, and I think that's why, unlike some other cities in Colorado, Denver hasn't had an explosion of these private clubs all over the city. If someone's walking down the mall with a joint and smoking a joint, City Council, I want to say back in 2013 or 2014, did make public consumption a civil infraction in Denver instead of a criminal infraction. So it's you're not going to get hit with a criminal ticket if you are caught publicly consuming, but I think it's a $100 fine maximum. So those are kind of some of the struggles that we've dealt with over the years.
Yeah, and I would just add, those businesses that we have worked with that we know that are operating, I guess I use the term businesses, but the social consumption places that are operating, we want to work with them now that we have this license opportunity. So we've sent letters to them notifying them that we think that what they're doing is walking that fine line between public and private. And we will work with them to bring them into the licensed to get them in and get licensed now that we do have that opportunity. And I would say too, I don't think, correct me if I'm wrong, Marley, but we have not had any compliance issues with the coffee joint yet, right?
No.
Yep.
They've been
And
great.
one other thing that I want to point out about the coffee joint model, the one consumption place that we do have operating, is that it is those people that run that coffee joint also own a store right next door. So that model that people have talked about both here in Colorado and in other states about having it somewhat be attached to a dispensary or a store is more or less that model that we're seeing here in Denver. It's a separate address and a separate entrance, but they are located right next door. So now I'm going to ask you guys to look in your crystal balls and see if you can tell us anything about what you think is going to happen, if you see any changes in the near future or where you think this is possibly headed. We'll start with you, Marley.
I mentioned earlier that a bill actually made it through our state legislative session this last session, so 2018, made it to the governor's desk but was vetoed. I think we're going to see that again. We've seen that in a state legislature since 2014 at least, maybe sooner than that. I anticipate that we'll see it again. The model that made it through, and I think that's the best model, and I think Sarah and Brandon have been talking about the model, is to allow on-site consumption. Right now, a retail marijuana store or a medical marijuana center can't allow consumption on-site. So that creates a lot of difficulties of where is it coming from? Is it coming from the black market? It's just a lot of, is there drug dealing inside of these establishments because they don't have any other place to buy it? I mean, it's just a lot of difficulties. So I think we're going to see that on-site consumption model coming through the state legislature next year.
Brandon?
Yeah, as I said, I think there will be at least a couple of bills in this upcoming session that starts in early 2019. And I took part in a thinking group that included some elected representatives and folks in the cannabis industry, some public health folks, and some other regulators. The ACLU of Oregon was also represented on what might these concepts look like. And there are some different options. The on-site model for someone who has a licensed cannabis retailer, that's definitely been considered. One model that I personally think should be a part of that package is also if you don't have a license, and I think I mentioned this briefly yesterday during the local government roundtable, if you have an event space and would like to just have events where people can come and consume cannabis, that might be a really good way for people who may not have the capital to meet all the requirements of a licensed cannabis facility to either produce or process or sell cannabis, for them to engage with the regulated cannabis industry. So that's important. Whether or not that consumption can take place indoors is going to be very tricky because of the Oregon Indoor Clean Air Act, which is very popular, has protected many, many workers over the years. And one thing that you do sometimes hear from the industry side as well, in Oregon there is a cigar bar exception for consuming indoors, but then you have to pretty quickly clarify that that was a grandfathering that took place. It was very limited, and there are no new cigar bars that are allowed to open. In my view, I don't think that having consumption indoors is maybe the right place to start at the state level at this time. But those are some of the things, and also I think Marley mentioned earlier, as part of Denver's ordinance, perhaps a 1,000-foot buffer between establishments might be part of it. Perhaps requirements that it needs to be out of the view of the public. And then, one more twist would be, if you have a model that is just the licensed cannabis business only, so if it's a model that you have a retailer that then has an adjoining space to consume, will you allow people to bring their own cannabis or not? And, you think about a bar model for liquor, you can't bring a bottle of your own liquor into a bar. I guess you can go to a restaurant and pay a corkage fee and enjoy a bottle of wine. But that's something to think about too. So, right now it's uncertain what's going to happen in Oregon, but I think it's more likely in 2019 than it was in 2017 that something will pass.
Great. Sarah, you guys have some changes possibly that could be made here, but how do you see that playing out over the next couple months or years?
So as I, as I said earlier, the board will be considering whether to adopt this 15-page regulation project in December. They could also make substantive changes and put it back out for public comment another time, or they could just kill the project entirely. I imagine if something doesn't get adopted regarding on-site consumption, that there will be lobbying by the industry to legislators. As I assume many other states, a lot is kind of depending on what happens next week. We are going to have at least 20% of our Senate change and 25% of our House change because of people not running for re-election, or they're running for different offices and whatnot. So with our state being a very funky state politically, we have a lot of libertarians, and we're a very red state when it comes to many elections. But our state is also, a lot of our representatives and stuff are very pro-marijuana. There's a lot kind of riding on this election. Also, our governor is the only governor in the nation right now who's an independent, and he recently has said that he is not running for re-election, so we will either have a Democratic governor or a conservative Republican governor this next 4 years. So there's a lot depending on that too. The board, our Marijuana Control Board, has requested that the legislature pass some sort of legislation that would create a special event permit for the types of events that we've talked about today. The board is very interested in having a place where they can have these types of conventions or trade shows or competitions or whatnot, where people who are 21 and over can legally consume and safely consume. But our requests go to the governor's office, and we've been working with the governor's legislative office to draft some legislation. But with our governor not being retained, I'm not sure exactly what will happen with that, but we are going to be sending out a resolution directly to all of the legislators who are voted in once they're in office. So it's possible that we will have legislation for that. And again, if our regulation project does not get adopted, then I imagine we'll probably have some legislation to that effect, but I don't know if it'll stall out or what.
All right, so some more unknowns coming. So I think I'll turn it over to questions here in a minute, unless you guys have anything else that you'd like to chime in on or add.
Actually, could I ask a question of City of Denver? You have one licensed social consumption facility. Do you have any sense as to why it's only the one, and kind of what feeds into that?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. And so we do have some thoughts. And we think basically it comes down to that we have a local solution for a statewide problem. And so we're one city in this state and there's some state laws that we've had to, as Marley said, thread the needle. I think Marley went through most of those, but some of the biggest barriers are that they can't make money, as we mentioned. They can't sell cannabis. They can't sell liquor. There's, a lot of stuff that has to go into opening up a business, whether it's an existing business. To add this type of liability to their existing business is something that we think discourages many people from doing it to an existing business. To open up a brand new business is a big lift. We've met with several people that are interested in it, but the hurdles that they have to go over to open up a business that may or may not be economically viable has kind of discouraged them and kept them at bay, I think. The indoor smoking, I think, is a big issue. We have heard, some of the statistics show us that people's preferred method of consumption is smoking, and so without having to have that inside, or without being able to smoke indoors, is also a discouraging business model. And outdoor consumption, outdoor smoking on a rooftop or on a patio, then adds some additional complications around, odors and, keeping it out of the public view, as you've mentioned. So I think those are the most of the hurdles that I can think of. Anything else, Marley?
I'd say, I think some feedback I've heard is that they have, how you have that community support requirement, and some folks have had difficulty getting that. Some folks have had difficulty getting approval from their landlord or their property owner. And then the other thing to remember about our initiative is that it's a pilot program. So it is, will automatically sunset December 31st of 2020. So that's going to be here tomorrow. I mean, that's a finger snap away. So I think they may be having trouble. I've heard this a little bit, that they're having trouble getting investors that are interested in such a potentially short-lived project. So,
And if they're a large national chain or something, some of the concerns about this still being unsure at the federal level might be one thing as well. Okay. All right, well, we'll throw it open to the audience if you have any questions.
Martin Kazanowicz with City of Moreno Valley. Was there any differentiation when you were considering these social places for consumption, separating the smoking from just eating consumption, regular consumption? Was that considered? Is there any differences in approach?
So in Denver, any smoking would have to happen outside, but so there's no separation of the method of consumption unless you are inside. Then it is just vaping and edibles that would be allowed.
and any of the consumption types, whether it's smoking outside, couldn't be visible to the public from a public place. So you'd have to have some kind of fencing or something to keep it private.
And I guess I'd just add too, because it is a bring your own model, I mean, where the product is coming from, there's no regulation over that, right? It could be something somebody grew or made at home, or something that they bought at a store. And there's no determination or, nothing you have to do about that when you walk into the business.
So in Alaska, we have not considered having a separate area for consuming edibles versus smoking. We do have a lot of our retailers who, from the beginning, set out a designated space for their consumption area, and they also were not contemplating having a separate place for smoking versus oral consumption.
Anything else?
No.
Hi, Carrie.
Hi, good morning. Carrie Atia with Visit Denver. You've all mentioned tourism and having places for tourists to be able to consume cannabis. Can you, specifically from Portland and Alaska, speak to for-hire vehicles, including limousines, buses, and other forms? Because we've had some issues here in Denver with those types of models as well. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the city of Portland explicitly does not allow for consumption in for-hire vehicles, whether they're a limo or a bus or what have you. That doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. It does. And so it doesn't come up all that often, but it does from time to time. And the other thing, and I'm glad you brought up the tourism point again. One thing I don't know if everyone knows, hotels in Oregon can designate up to 20% of their rooms as smoking rooms, so that could be either tobacco or cannabis. And frankly, I'm surprised I haven't seen more advertising of that from especially like boutique hotels. So if anyone's watching, that's an opportunity. You can designate some of your rooms for that purpose.
So in Alaska, our AG's opinion, I can't remember if it specifically calls out vehicles that allow smoking in the vehicles or not, but they would be included in the definition as described in the AG's opinion. We recently have been hearing about business models similar to those that exist in the other states, where people are driving tourists from one retailer to another, and I would imagine that there's consumption happening in those vehicles, but we have some investigations that are ongoing right now, but we don't explicitly prohibit in our statutes or regulations the vehicle model.
And Carrie didn't really ask, but for Denver, it all still comes down to the private versus public, answering that key question.
There are some narrow exceptions for limousines for private hire. Again, you get down to what's public, what's private. That analysis always is in play.
Good morning.
Hi. With alcohol, whether it's at a bar, a restaurant, or an event, consumption's limited to there on the spot. You can't, if you don't finish your beer, you can't take it with you. I'm curious how dosage is handled with on-site consumption, especially at events.
So in our local initiative that we have here in Denver, it's not addressed. Again, it's a bring your own model, so people can bring in, as much as they're allowed to legally possess, and how much they consume while they're there is not regulated. Anything else you want to add to that, Marley?
I think we limited the amount that people could bring on site, but if they don't consume it all while they're on site, they can put it in their pocket and take it home.
There are some limitations in there around, obviously distribution, but we do, you're allowed to share it basically, but without remuneration.
And let me just add that as part of what, state and local governments have to consider are things like, with edibles, activation time, for example. If you are maybe a new user to cannabis in particular, you might consume a cannabis edible, 15 minutes later, be like, that didn't work. And then if you drive home, that could potentially start affecting you during the ride home. That's something that some elected officials in Portland have expressed concern about with the social consumption model. And so to that end, in my view, if Oregon and Portland do create that framework, I would like to see an education component. Like I think Oregon, Colorado, and other states have really bought into the start low and go slow, as particularly for edibles. In Oregon, there's a 5 milligram per serving limit on edibles for that reason. And also to have information about taxis and ride shares and public transportation is all really important. But last, if you have a framework for social consumption, it does make it more likely that people who are new to cannabis have people around them that can provide them that education and information. And I think that that's a critical piece of this is providing adults a place to consume cannabis with other adults who may be more knowledgeable and can help them. That could really be a benefit.
So I think Brandon made some really good points about concerns of driving under the influence after consuming on site, and a lot of the comments in opposition to our regulation project noted that. So our current regulations have limits on the amount of cannabis that can be sold to a person in a single transaction. And those limits are 1 ounce of usable marijuana, more than 7 grams of marijuana concentrate for inhalation, or marijuana products if the total amount of marijuana products, or both marijuana and marijuana products sold contains more than 5,600 milligrams of THC. So the regulation change for the on-site consumption draft adds language that says these limits include marijuana or marijuana products sold for on-site consumption. And so somebody could, buy an ounce of marijuana and just smoke a gram or whatever, and would be able to take the rest of that home as long as it meets the packaging and labeling requirements set forth in our regulations. And similarly to Oregon, we have a 5 milligram per serving edible limit.
One more quick thing that does make this tricky is the difficulty that law enforcement has in being able to detect whether someone's under the influence of cannabis. There is no cannabis breathalyzer like we have for alcohol. If someone does come up with a product like that, they're going to become very wealthy. I know that's something that everybody is interested in, so that makes it a little bit more difficult too.
One of the other requirements in the Denver rules is that there's some requirements that you have to submit an employee training manual with your application. And so in there, they have to specify things like how the employees will be able to identify someone who's overly intoxicated, what types of actions they would take to ensure that they don't, leave the establishment and then drive. And making sure that the employees can prohibit or do things to stop distribution within inside of the business and things like that.
Well, you've almost answered most of my questions. I'm Brian Scott. I'm the Assistant City Attorney for the City of Las Vegas. We're now working through our social use venue ordinance. It's now at the business impact statement where we're getting comments from the business industry. We've held a bunch of workshops with the marijuana industry as well as the public. One of the things I had, or one of the things our electeds are concerned about, we have 42 million visitors come to Las Vegas every year. How do you then, you say you need to provide them with a legal place to smoke. How do you then educate those tourists as to what exactly enough is enough, or how do you train those employees to recognize when people have been overserved? Also, is there an issue with regard to employees being in that environment for so long? Are they getting the effects of the secondhand smoke from being on the job for 8 hours? Do you have any issues or regulations with regard to worker safety?
We have, the only thing that we have in rule in Denver is that if an employee is actually on duty on the designated consumption area, that they can't consume themselves. But there is no restriction on, you can only work a 4-hour shift at, anything like that. We didn't dig into it that deeply.
And then about the training of workers to identify people who've been overserved, is that a state requirement or is that a local requirement?
Local. We wrote that into the rules and regs that we wrapped around the citizen-initiated ordinance. We didn't designate who you had to get the training from, but I think, and I've heard, you may have more, Molly, that some businesses have popped up that provide those services already. And they were in existence even before this employee training kind of thing.
Okay.
So.
Yeah, we usually don't tell you what the training has to look like or how it has to be provided. They have to provide that documentation to us with their application, and then we'll review that to determine whether it's sufficient or not.
Okay. And one last question. For the city of Denver, since it's a pilot program, you said it ends in 2020. Will the council, I guess, make a determination whether to keep it going, even though there's only one you can use as a model? I guess since it's a model citizen, do you think it or anticipate it'll continue on a permanent basis?
Yeah, it will require an action by council to change the ordinance, and so we anticipate something will happen. What happens at the state level might determine what type of action our local city council takes, but we anticipate it to continue or to have some change at the state.
Great. Thank you. Appreciate it.
So in Alaska, our regulation project specifies that there has to be a separate area that's a smoke-free area for employees to monitor the marijuana consumption area, and then also a ventilation system for the consumption area. And so we've got that. And then as far as education goes, when our ballot measure passed, we were kind of at the beginning of a fiscal crisis in our state. The price of oil crashed, and a significant portion of our budget is dependent on oil revenue. So we did not get very many staff with the addition of marijuana to our alcohol program. We now have more staff, but we have been working very collaboratively with our Department of Health and Social Services team to get out public education. And I know that if this happens, we will continue to do so when it comes to on-site consumption and educating tourists and whatnot.
One interesting thing that we did add to our rules was that you have to have a sign on the outside of your establishment that designates it as a designated consumption area. We basically took that from Amsterdam's. They had a green and white sign that said coffee shop. And so ours is a green and white sign that just says designated consumption area. And so that was one thing that we did to just make sure the public knows that when they're walking into the building, they know that there could be consumption of marijuana in there. And back to Marley's her points about this extensive meeting process that we had to develop these rules. All of that information is on our website under the social consumption portion of our business licensing website, and the minutes and the agendas. And so we had very detailed agendas where we would go through topic by topic, and we would compare them to existing marijuana laws that we could adopt and compare them to state laws that we had to consider, and then what the proposal and the discussions were by that task force. Yep.
Hi, panel. I'm local law enforcement. So contrary to the popular sentiment that legalizing would ease the strain on law enforcement resources, my observation is that it's increased the strain on law enforcement resources. For instance, unequivocally, I've heard school resource officers say that possession in schools has increased significantly year to year. Local enforcement of DUIs involving marijuana is up. Distribution from illegal grows in residential areas. And we know that the licensed businesses engage in criminal activity. The Sweet Leaf example was given yesterday. So my question is, knowing that, what consideration has been given to staffing oversight of social consumption clubs? Because I can tell you there's a lot of us in the room who are trying to figure out how we're going to integrate oversight of social consumption clubs into our already hanging on by our fingernails, strained resource schedule.
Want to start?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a very fair question. And in Portland, what we have seen, frankly, from law enforcement is a mostly hands-off approach, particularly to the public consumption piece. With limited staffing resources, our programs, law enforcement, and frankly, almost all government programs do have to make tough decisions about where to invest those very limited staff hours. And so sometimes, our program is an administrative program. Some of that burden then falls on us to provide administrative enforcement, to provide that education to folks. But yeah, I think that's absolutely a fair point.
So in Alaska, since I'm a state regulator and not a city regulator, a lot of enforcement is done by local law enforcement teams, local police departments. Our state enforcement is the Alaska State Troopers. But as I said earlier, we wrote into our draft the ability for local governments to opt out or set restrictions when it comes to this on-site consumption piece. And so if there's a local government who has concerns about the enforceability or lack of resources on the enforcement end, they can certainly opt out or set additional restrictions. At the state level, our governor has recently increased the wages of troopers and has taken other acts to try to get more troopers to join. That's not directly related to cannabis and enforcement of cannabis, but since that's our enforcement team, I thought it was kind of important to bring that up. But it's really heavily dependent on local law enforcement. At our state level, for our regulators enforcement team, we've got 8 enforcement for the entire state of Alaska, which is a pretty large state. So that is very much a challenge, especially trying to get to some of the communities that are only accessible by plane or ferry, and where accessibility is really weather dependent. So we defer a lot to local jurisdictions.
And in Denver, this may have come up in another panel, but in the Denver Police Department, we have 2 dedicated marijuana teams of detectives and a sergeant. So I think between the 2 teams, there's probably about 12 to 15 officers. they weren't created specifically for this issue. Kind of to Molly's point, the one licensed place that we have has not been a problem. At least I haven't heard that it's been a problem. If they're dealing with social consumption issues, if that Denver Police team is dealing with social consumption issues, it's really surrounding the ones that are trying to fly under the radar as a private club. Those are extremely time-consuming, but the licensed one hasn't increased their calls to that area at all. So,
I guess the reason why I'm asking is because I know specifically your marijuana detectives have said that they have at least 60 marijuana complaints holding in their queue every day that they can't get to with the already existing licensed businesses in Denver. So dropping licensed social consumption on them, that's why I'm trying to figure out where the consideration for staffing is coming from.
I would say our teams they have 60 complaints in their queue, and those are all mainly home grows, not our licensed world. It's the home grow problem that we have.
Okay, thank you.
And actually in Alaska, similarly, we get lots of complaints as well, but they're largely about some illegal operators who have been driving around with giant signs on the back of their trucks saying, hey, buy marijuana from us online, or buy a Mylar bag online and you can donate however $250 and you get free marijuana. And so they've been driving around, and we get lots of complaints about that. But in order to expand our enforcement team, that requires additional expenditure authority from our state legislature. And because we're housed under the Department of Commerce, we as the staff forward our recommendations or requests for additional expenditure authority to the commissioner, who then decides within his divisions what the department's expenditure requests are going to be. And he forwards those to the governor, who then forwards those to the legislature. So it's kind of out of our hands to expand our enforcement team without legislative authority. Excuse me.
Hi, this is a question mostly for Oregon and Alaska, because I'm very familiar with Molly and Marley and all the great work they do with Denver Excise and License. I believe, Sarah, you mentioned that in Alaska you have prohibited the use of concentrates in your social consumption, and wondered how you got to that point, whether Portland you're considering that, and then for both of you, did you ever consider not allowing edibles in social consumption for the very reason that Brandon mentioned, the delayed reaction? And quite honestly, in our city, the complaints are around social consumption of smoke because of the environmental impact and the odor. Nobody's complaining about people consuming gummy bears on the street. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts on both of those issues.
Sure. So in our draft, our current draft that went out for public comment, it would prohibit the consumption of concentrates. The working group met when I was on maternity leave, so I can't completely speak to the thought there, but my understanding is that the thought in prohibiting the consumption of concentrates was specific to dabbing. I don't know if the board's going to be interested in allowing vaping or not, but I know that dabbing was on their minds. As far as the consumption of edibles goes, I know that there is interest, if the board decides to allow on-site consumption, that they specifically wanted to allow the consumption of edibles because we understand that a lot of our tourists are interested in consuming edibles, and our potency limit is 5 milligrams. So,
yeah, and as you mentioned, the most concern I've heard has been around the edibles piece, and also, as you said, it is interesting because Oregon's law says you can't consume cannabis in a public place, which means if I am walking down the street and I have a cookie, I cannot eat that cookie if it's infused with cannabis, but there's no deleterious effect to anyone around that person, at least not in my view. But then again, if you're in a place, you consume something, you wait a little bit, doesn't do anything, and then you leave, that's a concern. So right now there's no, to the best of my knowledge, there's no draft legislation yet. My sense is that these kinds of things will probably be hammered out in committee once it gets to that point. So if anyone wants to reach out to me in January, February, I'd be happy to talk more about that once it gets popping.
One other question, and I don't mean to insult anyone in the room, but does everybody here understand the dabbing? No. Okay, thank you. Can we maybe give an explanation of what dabbing is and what the potency levels of many of those products are? Because in Colorado, we have no potency limits, and so you could dab 90% THC. I've actually seen concentrates sold in our stores of 90% THC, and or whether we even have science around the effect of 90% THC in a dab hit.
Yeah, so essentially it's like super concentrated, it can be resin or wax, and you're right, it's extraordinarily potent. And I mean, what you mentioned, the science around it, I mean, that's a critical point to all these conversations. There's so little science around cannabis, which is why it would be great to have some loosening at the federal level so that we can study these things and know more about them. But yeah, like you said, essentially it's a super concentrated cannabis product, and so the effects hit you very quickly and it's very strong.
So we have about 10 minutes left, and I'm just curious if there's anybody here and I don't, unless there's another person that has a question, but just curious if anybody from California or Massachusetts or a state with statewide allowance for social consumption wants to chime in and give us your 2-minute rundown of where you've been. Anybody? No volunteers? Okay. Any other questions then? Any other comments from the panel? Well, I assume we'll be back here talking about this next year and may have a different landscape, and hopefully then we can hear some thoughts from those states that do have that statewide framework. So, all right, thank you.